Welcome to a YouTube video, my wonderful little nieces and nephews. Your dear Uncle Otter is back, and I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm doing crimes, namely, every crime but the icky ones. But do you know what else I'm doing? Delivering hot, freshly baked Grim Dawn builds directly to your door in 20 minutes or less, or you get your ad revenue back. Today we're talking about one of my favorite skills of all time, none other than the Demolitionist Mortar Trap, aka the world's deadliest can of Pringles. Speaking of which, this video is sponsored by Pringles. Cram this salty snack into your gullet. This build utilizes the Sorcerer class, which is a combination of the Arcanist and the Demolitionist. With Mortar Trap and Devastation, we can dish out immense AoE damage over time that is only hampered by the opportunity cost of having to constantly move our Mortar Traps. While the Sorcerer lacks in upfront defenses like total health and defensive ability, it makes up for it with Mirror, Blast Shield, Maven Sphere, and an immense amount of health regen. Finally, since all of our damage comes from Devastation and Mortar Trap, our character has absolutely no incentive to stand and fight, making it much easier to kite out enemies. The core of this build comes from the Pyran set, which does a myriad of things for us, including fully converting Devastation, making it deal 100% fire damage, bumping up its duration by a full 3 seconds, and giving Devastation the ability to shred flat resistance, taking away the need to invest devotion points into Rowan's Crown. It also adds a ton of flat damage and AoE radius to our mortar shots, turning our classic flavored Pringles into hot jalapeno flavored Pringles. Last but certainly not least, the Pyran set gives us a ton of flat health regen and a decent ability that we can weave in between our cooldowns. Other interesting items for our build include the Conduit of Destructive Whispers with the affix that gives our Vindictive Flame another flat 80 health per second, assuring our character has a ton of ambient sustain. The mythical Dawn Shard Grips, which allows us to have an additional Mortar Trap active, and the mythical Warp Fire Dagger, which has a proc that shreds fire resistance. Our devotions include Soleil's Witchblade for 23% reduced fire resistance, the 1-2 punch of Ozuin's Torch and Magi for the considerable boost of fire damage and huge fire damage over time procs, Behemoth to scale up our massive health regen and give us another source of sustain and bonus health, and last but certainly not least, Solemn Watcher for the handsome chunk of defensive ability and armor. In order to get this exact devotion set up, first invest a point into the Red Crossroads, unlocking the Viper constellation, nabbing us an easy source of resistance reduction. We can take our point in the crossroad back since Viper gives us red devotion. Now that we have blue devotion, pick up Sailor's Guide and Eel, two great constellations that give us a decent chunk of defensive ability and resistance, but more importantly also gives us the 10 blue devotion we need to pick up Solemn Watcher for even more defensive ability. Next up, we need to pick up some green devotion, so place 1 point in the green crossroads and then fill out the Spider constellation, which is a flexible stat spread for both casters and auto attackers. Take back a green point from the crossroads, then fill out Ghoul, which will further increase our health regen and give us a useful circuit breaker that bumps up our physical resistance. We now have enough for Soleil's Witchblade, which will bolster our damage over time by a considerable amount thanks to resistance reduction proc. 3 points in Hawk puts us over the threshold for Magi while boosting our offensive ability and critical strike damage. Fill out the Magi constellation to unlock the powerful Fissure proc for even more AoE fire damage and reliable CC. At this point, we're just a few red and green devotion away from Ozuin's Torch. Luckily, the Behemoth constellation satisfies that need perfectly while scaling our most powerful sustain stat, health regen. Now fill out every star in the Ozuin's Torch constellation for the Meteor Shower proc, and you'll notice we have 1 point remaining. Put that point in the Scarab constellation for bonus physique and armor. In the Demolitionist tree, go for the full 50 points to unlock the Big One modifier for our mortars, which only gets soft caps since it affects our mortars the least. Heavy Ordnance, however, gets overcapped for 2 reasons. It increases the effective radius for each of our mortar shots by 2 meters, meaning every shot hits a much larger area, and it gives every shot a chance to stun, which will keep us from getting surrounded. The Mortar Trap base skill at the minimum needs to be at 24 points in order to increase the summon limit to 3, but the more points the better to scale up its base damage. Thermite Mines gets soft cap since the resistance reduction suffers from diminishing returns after 16 points, and a healthy 10 points in Blast Shield gives us an incredibly strong circuit breaker that will save our bacon flavored Pringles often. Vindictive Flame and Ozuin's Wrath need to only get a single point as total speed doesn't do too much for us besides letting us run faster and place mortars quicker, but we need to unlock it to take advantage of the health regen from our amulet. Blackwater Cocktail is a great devotion procer since it shreds offensive ability and, with the modifier, physical damage dealt. Overcap Flame Touch for the bonus fire damage and healthy chunk of offensive ability, and apply bonus points to Temper for the added defensive ability. In the Arcanist tree, we go for 50 out of 50 points, which unlocks 2 very important nodes, Star Pact and Devastation. First, let's talk about Star Pact since it's a bit more complicated. Some of you may be wondering why I wouldn't go for Reckless Power here instead of Star Pact. The answer is pretty simple. Reckless Power will give our build 2 beneficial things, percent bonus to fire damage and casting speed. While percent fire damage is nice, it's not going to make or break this build, and we've already established that casting speed is nice, but it doesn't really affect our overall DPS in any meaningful way. Next, let's check out Star Pact. The only benefit we get here is cooldown reduction. So, is it worth it? The answer is unequivocally yes. Cooldown reduction is one of the strongest stats in the game, and especially for this build, as it affects the cooldown of Mirror, Blast Shield, Devastation, and Mortar Trap, allowing us to survive encounters we shouldn't and deal more consistent damage output. Next, let's address the physical to cold damage conversion. Since Mortar Traps deal a huge amount of physical damage, shouldn't Star Pack lower our DPS? The answer is actually no. The way that conversion works is that it's going to factor in our gear's damage conversion before factoring in Star Pack. And since we have 100% physical to fire conversion to Mortar Trap on our gear, Star Pack never gets a chance to convert physical to cold. Maven's Sphere and Conversion gives us a ton of sturdiness as well as a CC reduction we need to effectively kite. Inner Focus is a massive 12% boost to our offensive ability, so it gets soft capped. Iskandra's Elemental Exchange is an important buff for our Elemental Focus build, but the most important note of the three is the Elemental Balance, since our build has a huge amount of offensive ability, so I soft capped it for 25% crit damage. Finally, we have a bunch of powerful skills that don't scale as well for our build, so they remain at 1 point. When leveling this build, I fully recommend a Quick Jacks based Demolitionist build that utilizes Arcanist to curb mana expenditure and increase cast speed. Focus on Stun Jacks first and make sure you pick up the Quick Jacks modifier ASAP. Before going all in on full spread, max out Vindictive Flame for extra damage, move speed, cast speed, and insane sustain. Later on, you're going to want to max out Thermite Mines for the resistance reduction. This build absolutely thrives in instances where mobility and speed aren't a huge factor. Due to the nature of the build, Mortars makes you an absolute top tier Crucible farmer, able to clear the coveted Gladiator 150 to 170 in around 5 minutes. However, the trade-off means that Shattered Realms and specific loot farming from totems and dungeons suffers. The playstyle of this build allows you to set and forget your mortars and really focus on positioning, while waves of enemies simply melt. Very similar to pet builds, but with a bit more of an active role. Well, nieces and nephews, that's it for this video, and yep, just heard it now. Pringles has just pulled out of the sponsorship, probably on account of all those crimes that I commit. If you want to pick up the mantle supporting me, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Maybe touch that bell, give it a little ringling, warning the townfolk of impending redcoats. If you want to support me further, you can slide pieces of ham underneath my door, and remember, if it's a thick slice of ham, you might have to force it.